Julius Caesar, the Colosseum, and gladiators are the first things that spring to mind when we think of ancient Rome. Unquestionably, one of the most famous periods in ancient history was the Roman Empire, which existed from 753 BC to 476 AD. The impact of ancient Rome has persisted throughout the ages, even influencing the modern Western world. From aggressive chariot racing to pet lions, Roman culture was complete with surprises. We'll show you what life was like in ancient Rome, so be ready to discard all you thought you knew. Gladiators were trained to die. The main focus of gladiators' existence was winning and entertaining spectators. Gladiators were schooled in fighting abilities and the art of delivering and receiving a deadly blow, since gladiatorial combat was as much about the show as it was about survival. Some gladiators did die in the arena, but not all battles ended in death. Throughout the Roman era, gladiator bouts got more vicious as their popularity increased. Approximately 25% of gladiator combatants died during the 3rd century. Slaves could buy their freedom. In ancient times, slavery had a convoluted and lengthy history. Manumission, or the idea that slaves may be set free, was one way that Roman slavery was different from slavery in other societies. While some Roman slave owners simply liberated their captives, others let them use whatever presents they'd collected to pay for their freedom. Slaves were motivated to work hard and obeyed by the possibility of freedom. But the process was complicated. Other slaves never made enough money to purchase their freedom, and others still struggled to escape the stigma associated with slavery after being set free. Romans had short workdays. Productivity and relaxation were equally essential aspects in the work week in ancient Rome. Romans didn't have clocks, thus they were awakened by the sun at 6 in the morning. After breakfast, they'd work until the early afternoon, at which point they'd unwind. Since most people were too occupied watching gladiator bouts, chariot races, wrestling contests, or going to the theater or baths, only a few shops would remain open into the early afternoon. Most taverns remained open all day as gathering places for food and drink. Fires were extremely common. The same construction materials that we have now were unavailable to people in ancient Rome. Because Roman insulation was constructed of mud and wood, it was prone to collapsing and burning. The Romans' use of hot coals and open flames to cook meals in their dwellings did nothing to alleviate the continual danger of fires caused by the city's dense population and close-knit layout. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD was one of the most notorious. It destroyed a large portion of the city during its 6-day, 7-night rampage. Banquets followed the same format. Just throwing a dinner was insufficient for the wealthiest people in ancient Rome. Banquets were significant social and political gatherings where attendees could network, make alliances, and flaunt their riches and rank. They were about much more than simply eating and drinking. Typically, every feast had the same lavish structure. As they ate, guests lounged on sofas and enjoyed appetizers, a main meal, and entertainment from acrobats and musicians. As they served their cuisine, the cooks would sometimes even sing. It was not unusual for real bears and lions to show up if the host was wealthy. The ancient mountain made of pots. Ancient Rome placed a great value on olive oil. The Romans brought it in from around the globe to use in medicine, baths, and other applications. They soon found themselves surrounded by many empty clay pots and nothing to do with them since they drank so much oil. After usage, these cracked pots were thrown away because the oil residue would become rancid, rendering them unfit for further use. These abandoned pots eventually piled up to form the enormous man-made mound still visible today atop Monte Testaccio, often called Potsherd Mountain. Emperors owned wild animals. Throughout Roman history, there have been odd and eccentric rulers. They could show off their riches and enact odd laws since they had all the authority and public backing. Among Rome's most eccentric emperors was Emperor Elagabalus. Disregarding all the ancient Roman traditions, he was notorious for his scandalous parties and was just a youngster when he began his reign. Like many previous emperors, he kept lions and bears, among other exotic creatures, and let them wander freely during his festivities. Baking was a lucrative job. While grain served as money throughout the Roman era, it could be used for little other than making bread. Because the majority of Romans lacked ovens, bakers were essential to society. In ancient Rome, baking bread was a respectable and very profitable job. The individuals in charge of the commercial and bread ovens were respected and loved. They often participated in civic elections and sought for political office. Gladiators' armor was only for show. You would be gravely incorrect if you believed there was just one kind of gladiator in ancient Roman times. Over 24 varieties are said to have existed, each having armor and weaponry for use in combat. Despite its stunning appearance, it was mostly a show. The armor wasn't modeled after the natural armor used in combat. Some gladiators wore just a few armor pieces for more mobility during combat, while others wore whole suits. It was intended to maintain equity and provide the audience with additional entertainment. There were no trained doctors or hospitals. In ancient Rome, anybody needing medical care was very well doomed. In those days, the closest thing to a hospital was a tent where troops would rest on the battlefield. There was no such thing as a professional doctor. Roman citizens were forced to depend on self-styled physicians, a title anybody might claim without official training. Instead of modern medical knowledge, the capacity to keep patients alive was often used to judge success. People in Rome understood little about the human body's interior since autopsies were forbidden. Justice was based on social status. Social standing had a significant impact on justice in ancient Rome. Even though there was no police, individuals nevertheless exercised restraint. If someone killed someone else, it was the victim's family's responsibility to pursue justice, which often led to the offender's demise, unless they were of a higher social class. Later, establishing the legal system permitted charges against superiors, although money usually influenced the results. Because of their alleged services to society, the wealthy frequently received short sentences and moderate penalties, while those of lesser class received severe penalties. While maintaining a feeling of social order, the system continued to benefit the strong. Branding started in Rome. Putting your name on everything you've manufactured is relatively common nowadays. Individuals in Rome marked their goods before selling them, indicating that this practice is not new. Everything was branded, including glasses, ceramics, and bread. Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, a Pompeian citizen known as a renowned fish sauce manufacturer, was one of the most well-known instances. Aulus Umbricius Scaurus was so successful at marketing and branding his name on mosaics, ceramics, and fish sauce bottles that it was found on around 29% of Pompeii's fish sauce containers. Rome was covered in billboard advertising. Companies spend millions of dollars on advertising budgets, particularly for events like the Super Bowl. However, were you aware that this was taking place in ancient Rome? You may be shocked to hear how heavily the Roman games were promoted, and they were a significant event across the city. Handouts were distributed on the streets to persuade people to attend. Emperors would commission enormous paintings on buildings, and individuals would graffiti images of sure gladiators. At one point, Emperor Augustus even advertised his games with real crocodiles. Worshipping the many gods. Being a polytheistic society, the Roman Empire acknowledged and worshipped many gods and goddesses, at least 67 to be exact, not to mention all the demigods. Among the principal goddesses were Minerva, Jupiter, and Juno. Ancient Romans often constructed shrines for spirits because they thought they controlled and protected everything, including their houses, rivers, and trees. They used them to flaunt their riches as well as for devotion. In Roman culture, the richer you were, the more spectacular your shrine. One goddess had her own cult. Cybele was one of the most culturally essential goddesses the ancient Romans appropriated from various nations. The Frisian goddess, Cybele, sometimes called Magna Mater or Great Mother, represented the soil, fertility, and motherhood. She also had some thrilling ceremonies for her cult of believers. Males dedicated themselves to serving Cybele by castrating themselves as part of euphoric rites. In 204 BC, the Roman Senate formally acknowledged the religion of Cybele, and the Megalesia, an annual celebration held in her honor, rose to prominence as one of Rome's most significant religious holidays. Octopus was the first urban legend. Urban legends are hardly a recent invention, if tales from ancient Rome are any indication. The tale of the enormous octopus that tormented the city of Puteoli is regarded as one of the first urban legends, and Aelian, a writer from the 3rd century AD, initially recorded it. The octopus, it is said, became weary of its diet at sea and entered the city via the sewage system to eat pickled fish at a merchant store. Because the beast was so big, it required teamwork to kill or capture it. Female slaves had a tough time. Female slaves in ancient Rome had little control over their lives and had complicated, sometimes cruel lives. They might be purchased, sold, or punished at the whim of their masters since they were regarded as property. While some female slaves were pushed into more intimate duties, such as performers or concubines, others were employed as household workers. Although these women often faced hard labor and abuse, some were able to acquire their independence or authority in the home by being resourceful and resilient. Cold plunging is nothing new. Baths were used for exercise and relaxation in ancient Rome. Before taking a bath, guests might participate in various physical exercises in the palaestrae, or exercise areas, found in many thermae. The workout programs included weightlifting, ball games, and wrestling to preserve physical prowess. After working up a sweat, bathers would unwind and purify themselves in the frigidarium, or cold plunge, tepidarium, or warm bath, and caldarium, hot bath, either alone or with their Roman companions. Praying looked very different. People often prayed to the spirits surrounding them in ancient Rome, where religion was deeply ingrained in everyday life. Since the spirit's gender was usually unknown, they would refer to them as god or goddess to avoid upsetting them, since mispronouncing their gender would have resulted in their disregard. Romans looked everywhere for weaknesses in their religious rituals to ensure that prayers were heard. Farmers would sacrifice a pig before plowing the ground as part of daily rituals and sacrifices to placate these spirits. It was thought that this method compensated for the ground disturbance. Baths were mostly men-only zones. Women were often excluded from the grandest and most ornate baths, primarily male-only areas, while some Roman bathhouses maintained special hours or separate facilities for women. The Roman social structure and moral rules, which placed a high value on modesty and restricted gender relations, were primarily to blame for this exclusion. Furthermore, Roman males saw the baths as essential venues for networking in politics, commerce, and society, where women were often barred. Despite having hygienic facilities, women's access to and involvement in these essential social activities was severely restricted by cultural constraints. It paid to be a chariot racer. Do you realize that the majority of ancient Roman chariot racers were slaves? Particularly for the racers themselves, chariot racing was a profitable enterprise. Despite the risk, many slaves willingly participated since winning meant receiving a sizable portion of the profits. It was also expected to wager on chariot races. Some racers would even wager on their success to gain a sizable sum of money. There was also no allegiance, in case you were curious. The white and red drivers often moved teams to join the most successful teams. Slaves wore plaques as punishment. In ancient Rome, slaves who misbehaved or tried to flee were often punished by having to wear a plaque or force around their necks to successfully serve as a kind of public shame and punishment against future disobedience. This plaque, known as a titulus, would usually carry inscriptions describing the slave's name, transgression, and contact information for their owner. Slaves' owners' authority was strengthened by these plaques, which not only indicated the slave's rank, but also made it more straightforward to apprehend and return them if they tried to flee again. Was the thumbs down from Gladiator real? Ancient Rome appeared on the big screen in the classic film Gladiator. The moment when the emperor uses his thumb to determine the gladiator's fate, either up or down, is among the most famous. But did it take place in Rome stadiums? The exact movements and whether the judges used their thumb have been hotly debated. In contrast to the film, some historians proposed that the thumbs up suggested the losing gladiator should be executed, while a thumbs down meant he should be spared. Emperors mingled at the baths. The Romans used public baths daily, and it didn't take long for them to turn into disease breeding grounds. Despite this, emperors continued to visit the baths like local celebrities to interact with the populace and support their public campaigns. The emperors relished having an entourage to attend to their needs, whereas the plebeians went back to massaging against stone walls or using oil to exfoliate in the baths. These individuals carried their robes, applied oil to the emperor's skin, and scraped it off with a strigil. Marble heads without bodies. Every museum visitor has seen several statues portraying well-known individuals from the Roman Empire. Why are so many Roman senators, philosophers, and emperors' marble heads missing their bodies? The lengthy process of creating whole marble sculptures is the reason for this peculiar occurrence. Because of their brief lives and reigns, several emperors passed away before the artist could complete the body's sculpture. Designing detachable heads to switch heads on a single body was far more economical. Inflation caused financial strain. Since ancient Rome, inflation has been a societal problem. Throughout the Roman Empire, currency fluctuated, and many emperors attempted to counteract this differently. Financial troubles were prevalent regularly since pricing often relied on people's incomes. In an attempt to reduce inflation, Emperor Diocletian instituted price restrictions, but they were ineffective. People like farmers were paid far less than painters and other skilled craftspeople. As a result, it may take weeks of labor to acquire necessities like footwear. Rome overflowed with imported goods. Particularly in the area of population growth, Rome was a flourishing culture. For long, their burgeoning population had much more demand than supply. Importing things from all across the Mediterranean was thus the answer, and each nation had something novel and exciting to offer. Treasures ranging from pigs, ivory, and gems to wood and salt were abundant in Rome's marketplaces. This allowed Roman inhabitants to experience the thrill of global goods. Naturally, however, the imported items were only accessible to the wealthy. Emperor Nero's reign of tyranny. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, was the great-great-grandson of Emperor Nero. In the year 54 AD, he took control. At 17 and during his disastrous 14-year tenure, he was irrevocably regarded as the worst emperor in Rome's history. Although he had some dubious pastimes, he's credited for improving Rome's food supply and modernizing the tax code. To amuse himself, Nero was known to disguise himself, prowl the streets, stab people, and dispose of their remains in sewers. His rule ended only when he was sentenced to death by the Senate. Romans loved chariot racing. The only sport more popular than gladiator bouts in ancient Rome was chariot racing. It was similar to NASCAR in the past, but more risky. Before the chariots thundered into arenas like the magnificent Circus Maximus, where more than 200,000 enthusiastic fans awaited, the races started with a grand procession through the streets of Rome, creating excitement. Red, white, blue, and green were the colors of the characters who competed for several teams. As the charioteers circled the 2,000-foot sand track at high speeds, each team had its devoted following of spectators from all social strata. Communal bathrooms often exploded. Although it was a remarkable achievement at the time, the sewage system in ancient Rome was quite different from what it is now. The Cloaca Maxima was built as a sewerage system in the 6th century BC to enhance the expanding metropolis. Dangerous gases like methane rapidly accumulated because there were so many latrines or common restrooms scattered across public spaces. The sewage system was not impervious to the rare explosion or toilet fire because of its vaulted ceilings and inadequate ventilation. Public turned on Emperor Pompey. Because retaining the allegiance of the populace was essential to political stability, emperors in ancient Rome recognized the value of doing so. A crucial means of providing entertainment for the populace was the Roman games. Even well-known individuals like General Pompey might suffer the repercussions of misjudging the populace's mood. He brought 20 elephants to his games, hunting them one at a time. When the elephants attempted to flee, the audience realized how distressed they were, and this backfired. Pompey became one of the most despised rulers when the populace turned against him. Romans believed in witchcraft. Both revered and feared, witchcraft and magic were profoundly embedded in ancient Roman culture. Although the government attempted to control magic, it was pervasive, and many Romans turned to sorcerers or witches for assistance. Spells, ritual figurines, binding curses, and magical writings were commonplace. Poisons, regarded as magical potions, were employed throughout the Republic and imperial eras to accomplish specific objectives, such as protecting others or maintaining silence. Romans created the first ever joke book. Since the dawn of human civilization, humor has been a timeless constant. The Romans seem to be quite severe, yet history demonstrates otherwise. The Philogellus, now regarded as the earliest joke book, was written by the Romans in the 3rd or 4th century during the period of the fall of the Roman Empire. The book, which translates to the laughter lover, has 265 jokes on topics including societal stereotypes, physiological functions, and marital infidelity. Although it's difficult to say if they would still be seen as humorous now, demonstrates that comedy has always existed. Gladiators were far from glamorous. The stars of Rome were gladiators. For years, these famous people have been the focus of poetry and movies. Yet their lives were far more complex than they're sometimes shown to be. Gladiators were slaves to their Ionista, who ruled over every element of their existence, including a demanding training and meal routine, and they forfeited all of their freedom. People avoided becoming gladiators at all costs since they had to give up their liberty for combat, and the majority of them were once social misfits or former slaves. Some turned to extreme means to get out of their situation, such as killing themselves or leaving the city. Poor people lived in high-rises. Rome was one of the first cities to have a population of 1 million. Of course, everyone needed a place to live, and Rome's streets were renowned for being crammed with people in apartments. By constructing upward rather than outward, they could build high-rise residential complexes known as insula. They could reach heights of 100 feet. While the poor were stranded at the top, vulnerable to fire and deteriorating infrastructure, the wealthier people were kept on the lower levels. Slaves endured unimaginable punishments. Depending on their masters, Roman slaves had a very different experience. Slaves controlled by the city would be in charge of erecting public structures, while those employed by landowners would often do physically taxing jobs. All slaves were tortured in the event of a slave owner's death, and if any one of them was convicted of a crime, they may all be executed. Slaves were sometimes thrown into eel ponds as a form of punishment under Emperor Augustus, who was notoriously harsh with them. Only when Emperor Hadrian enacted legislation outlawing the killing of slaves did these harsh regulations alter. Romans borrowed gods from other cultures. The Romans were renowned for assimilating various customs they encountered as they expanded their empire. Assimilation and incorporating gods and goddesses from other civilizations into their religious rituals was one of the most prevalent. Once the region was subjugated, Roman troops would offer prayers to the city's deity, asking them to participate in the celebrations in Rome. This method, referred to as syncretism, enabled them to adjust and embrace new gods and beliefs as they came across them. For instance, Roman troops quickly learned to love the Persian mythological figure Mithras. Roman games put Caesar in debt. One of the most well-known figures in Roman history is Emperor Julius Caesar, who most likely gained notoriety as the host of the Roman Games. He would often make lofty claims of grandeur to impress the onlookers. That also meant keeping his word. Caesar allegedly had 320 gladiators battling in silver armor and acquired exotic beasts from Africa. But he also racked up a mound of debt due to his unrelenting quest to become emperor. Interesting bruise remedy. Because of the many conflicts, congested streets, and chaotic city life, it's logical to assume that bruises were far more prevalent in ancient Rome than now. Back then, medicine synthesized science, religion, and superstition. One especially intriguing treatment for bruising was the use of wild boar droppings. To cure a bruise, doctors would often use vinegar-soaked dried boar droppings. Because of their therapeutic qualities, fresh droppings were desired by chariot racers who suffered wounds and hemorrhaging. Firefighters were also police. Because there was never a sufficient police force to maintain order, crime was rampant in ancient Rome. Instead, it was mainly the populace's responsibility to keep the city in order, with occasional help from the Vigiles. Around 6 AD, Emperor Augustus formed the Vigiles, a police and firefighting unit in ancient Rome. In addition to having firefighting tools like buckets, hooks, and pumps, they also functioned as a crude version of the police, handling offenses like theft and vandalism. There were female gladiators. In ancient Rome, gladiator combat was not limited to males. Although women were far less prevalent than men, they did participate in gladiatorial combat. Only 2 game editors in history, Emperor Caesar and Emperor Domitian, decided to allow women to join in their Roman games. That changed in 200 AD when Emperor Septimius Severus forbade any ladies from competing in the arena. People committed insurance fraud. It's hardly surprising that individuals started purchasing fire insurance in ancient Rome since fires were frequent there. Of course, only the wealthy could afford such a significant luxury. Additionally, it meant that the Romans were among the first to experience insurance fraud. Because they were often paid more for their houses than they were worth, many started to invest in them and insure the contents, only to have them inexplicably burned down. To address the problem, Emperor Augustus punished arsonists severely. Banquets were the pinnacle of opulence. Showing off their riches was one thing the Roman social elite enjoyed more than anything else. The wealthiest members of societies would show off their wealth by hosting lavish dinners, displaying their extravagance. A sumptuous table was typically surrounded by a U-shaped arrangement of 3 gold and ivory sofas. Luxurious silverware and drinking containers of pricey materials like bronze, silver, and gold, or fine Roman glass were used to embellish the table. Their purpose was to be nothing less than remarkable. Dogs were treated as family. For tens of thousands of years, people have loved dogs as much more than simply pets, and they are often regarded as man's best friend. In ancient Roman culture, they were regarded as family members and were prized for their hunting prowess and devotion. Smaller breeds like Maltese were kept as friends, while larger Molossan dogs were retained for hunting and protection. There were also dog-themed murals and mosaics all across the city. Men were powerful, women were not. There was a notable disparity in authority between the sexes in Roman society. Men possessed the preponderance of authority and power in the household. They were in charge of making crucial choices like setting up weddings, ending their wives' marriages, and even choosing what would happen to newborns if they didn't want another kid or couldn't support the new family member. Conversely, women's liberties and rights were restricted. They were supposed to get married, have kids, and run the home. Women were often confined to household duties like cooking, cleaning, or handicrafts. One holiday turned Rome upside down. Nothing was more prevalent in ancient Rome than letting one's hair fall loose. On one occasion, shops and law courts were closed so everyone could attend the parties usually reserved for the wealthy. Saturnalia, the festival celebrating Saturn, began on a single day, December 17th. but the celebrations expanded to last a whole week throughout the ages. Social conventions were broken at Saturnalia, and for a brief time slaves were considered equals and granted rights while owners served their slaves. The celebration was a time of happiness and liberation from Roman society's customary constraints. Streets of Rome were dangerous. For various reasons, it was dangerous to stroll around the streets of ancient Rome. The roads quickly got narrower and smaller due to the large number of structures constructed to house the expanding population. People had to be very careful while they were going along the streets. Due to the high population density, it would be in danger of being crushed if not for the falling roof tiles caused by shoddy and inexpensive construction. As if that weren't awful enough, foul smells were everywhere because of the poor sanitation, which led to people emptying chamber pots onto the street. Roman baths were all-inclusive. Archaeologists have discovered unique artifacts throughout the years that provide light on everyday life in ancient Rome. The Roman baths were one of the most important discoveries. We found that they were much more than simply a place for people to bathe together, since so many still stand today. In addition, they offered facilities for socializing, working out, and other activities. The baths of Caracalla, for instance, were around the size of a small village. They had a gym, library, and 2 enormous fountains in addition to bathing sections, and they could hold up to 1,600 bathers at once. Temples doubled as banks. Making money and having pleasure were the 2 main focuses of life in ancient Rome. Temples were used as both banks and places of worship because religion was so entwined with daily life. Since the gods regarded money and jewels as holy and protected, people might store them for safekeeping. Additionally, temples would lend money to individuals and companies with the interest going toward the temple's funding. However, since fires were frequent, and if anything was destroyed, dividing the money among many temples was advantageous. Roman games were an all-day spectacle. In ancient Rome, the Roman games were a huge event. These activities were meticulously planned to provide the adoring spectators with a whole day of excitement, and they were much more than simply a single gladiator fight. They followed a set format and often started with an animal battle against humans or other animals. Acrobats, chariot races, and the last gladiator fights were among the following attractions. Animals were often brought into the arena using elevators and trapdoors to increase the thrill. From beginning to end, the whole event was exciting. Some slaves had higher authority. In ancient Rome, slavery was a fundamental institution, and slaves were essential to the city's everyday operations and economics. Depending on the individuals they served, certain slaves enjoyed more status, even while the majority had little rights and liberties. Higher power was granted to those working in affluent homes or with specific knowledge. Caligula was a notoriously brutal emperor. He showed tremendous partiality towards certain of his slaves, granting them control over others and unique benefits. Unconventional Roman cleaning methods. In ancient Rome, bathing and cleanliness were highly valued. Although they weren't present in every part of the city, public restrooms and baths were somewhat familiar. People thus needed a substitute to utilize in between visits. Chamber pots were created as a practical garbage collection method, particularly for use at night or in inclement weather. Essentially merely a colloquial term for pee, chamber lye was extracted from the chamber pots and used as an early washing detergent. Urine's ammonia was even used as a whitener. Worst punishment of them all. In ancient Rome, punishments were harsh and uncommon. Crucifixion was seen as the last penalty, but parricide, the murder of one's parents or other close relatives, was subject to a considerably weirder retribution. Haena, also known as the punishment of the sack, including the condemned person being thrown into a body of water where they would drown while in a bag containing a variety of animals, including a dog, rooster, snake, and monkey. It sounds unpleasant. If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon